Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I knew the roast was going to be dry, overcooked, underseasoned, and probably paired with one of my mother's awkwardly forced attempts at small talk, but I didn't expect the evening to boil over into something much darker, heavier, and oddly satisfying. You know that feeling, don't you? That pit in your stomach before walking into a room full of people who are supposed to love you, but somehow always manage to remind you you're not enough. That was me, driving back to my parents' house, gripping the steering wheel too tight, trying to calm my nerves with a deep breath that did absolutely nothing. The house hadn't changed. Same shutters. Same crack in the front step. Same front door my father refused to fix because, in his words, it still opens, doesn't it? As if things that barely work should be considered fine, just because they function. I rang the bell even though I knew the door would be unlocked. It was symbolic, really, like knocking on the door of a past that never welcomed me fully. My mother greeted me with that half-smile she always gave when she wasn't sure whether to be happy I came or annoyed I didn't call more often. Behind her stood my father, arms crossed, that tired smirk already on his face, like he had 100 things he wanted to criticize and couldn't decide which to lead with. Tom was already there, of course. Tom the brilliant. Tom the accomplished. Tom with his new tailored jacket and that smug aura that filled the room before he even opened his mouth. His wife, Lindsay, followed behind, carrying a bottle of wine like she was doing us all some goddamn favor. I swear, that woman could hand you a cup of water in a desert and still make it feel like charity. We sat at the dinner table like actors in a play everyone had rehearsed for decades. My mother dished out the roast, dry as expected, and my father launched straight into the monologue. Tom's promotion, Tom's house, Tom's financial advisor, Tom's life insurance policy. Hell, I was waiting for a full PowerPoint presentation on Tom's bowel movements. And me? I was wallpaper. Not once did anyone ask about my work, my life, my business. Nothing. Like I didn't exist beyond a placeholder for a failed daughter. I cut my meat with slow, steady movements, each slice a distraction from the burn creeping up my throat. I'd been through this 100 times, but for some reason, tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way my father was looking at me, like I was some kind of disappointment he tolerated out of duty, not love. It wasn't until dessert that he dropped the line. The line that snapped whatever was left of my patience, not with anger, but with a calm, icy finality. He leaned back, wiped his mouth with a napkin like he was about to deliver the Sermon on the Mount, and said, "You know, Maya, your brother's career really makes you look like a failure." Just like that. No hesitation. No laugh. No sugarcoating. Just a cold-blooded sentence dropped like a hammer on my chest. I stared at him for a second, letting the words hang in the air, heavy and foul. My mother looked down at her plate. Lindsay raised an eyebrow like she was watching a tennis match. Tom? He smiled. That same fucking smile he's had since we were kids, and he figured out the world would always choose him first. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't yell or cry or slam my fork down like some drama queen. No. I just smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and placed it gently on the table. "You know," I said quietly, "I've been meaning to show you something." My fingers unlocked the screen, and I opened the folder I'd been saving for just this moment. Years of silence, years of biting my tongue, years of playing small just to keep the peace, and now it was time to watch it all come undone. I had one thing on that screen that would make their precious Tom look like a fucking joke. It's strange how the moments that shape your life the most don't come with fireworks or fanfare. They come in the quiet dismissals, the shrugged-off accomplishments, the way someone glances past you as if you were barely worth noticing. I don't think I ever made a conscious decision to stay silent. It just became easier over time, a habit that grew deeper each time I opened my mouth only to have my words buried under someone else's louder pride. It started back in high school, I suppose, when I won the regional science competition and came home beaming, holding that small gold plaque like it was a key to finally earning my father's approval. But all he said was, "That's nice, Maya," before turning back to the television where Tom's basketball game was playing, and even though Tom's team had lost, somehow that seemed to matter more than my victory ever could. That moment set the tone for the years that followed, years of small triumphs that fell on deaf ears, of report cards with straight A's met with distracted nods, of school counselors praising me while my parents kept asking if I'd considered helping Tom with his resume. I remember how my mother forgot to buy a cake for my graduation party, and my father didn't show up at all, said he had to help Tom pack for a last-minute business trip. Tom got a cake for passing a licensing exam, by the way. A chocolate one with thick white frosting and a stupid little banner that read, "To a brighter future." Mine was just an email from my college advisor saying congratulations, sent to an inbox nobody in that house ever checked. And yet, I kept pushing forward. I applied to grad school, paid for it myself with 2 part-time jobs, and when that didn't feel like enough, I started dabbling in freelance coding. That's what my father called it anyway, dabbling, as if writing thousands of lines of code, building digital infrastructures, and launching a fully operational e-learning platform was just some quirky little phase. Maya's doing something with computers, he used to say to relatives, shrugging like he couldn't quite remember what it was I actually did, like my work was this vague, fuzzy concept that didn't deserve a real name because it didn't come with a corner office and a necktie. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I was quietly building something bigger than any of them could imagine. The platform I started from my 1-bedroom apartment had grown into a multi-million-dollar company in under 3 years. I reinvested every dollar, learned how to negotiate contracts, how to build teams remotely, how to scale without losing control. I bought my first property with cash, then another one 6 months later. I diversified into rentals, partnered with developers, grew my assets like a chess player thinking 10 moves ahead. But I told no one. Not a word. Not even my closest friends knew just how deep the roots of my success went, because I wasn't building it for praise, I was building it for myself. And maybe, just maybe, for the day I'd finally get to shove it in their faces. But it wasn't just pride keeping me quiet, it was bitterness too. That quiet, slow-burning kind that seeps into your bones when you realize your own family will never see you for who you are. I'd bring up a project I was excited about, and my father would change the subject to Tom's quarterly bonus. I'd talk about expanding my team, and my mother would ask if I'd considered going back to school to get a real job. It was exhausting. It was soul-deep exhaustion, and at some point, silence felt like armor. If they weren't going to listen, why waste the words? And yet, I kept track. Every success, every milestone, every press mention, every investor meeting, every single damn email congratulating me on my growth, I kept them all. Not because I needed their validation, but because some part of me, buried beneath years of forced humility, still wanted them to know they were wrong about me. That all this time, while they were busy polishing Tom's trophies, I was building an empire in the background. Have you ever been made to feel like nothing just because you weren't the favorite? Have you ever watched your achievements dissolve into thin air while someone else was praised for simply showing up? I'm curious, how did you deal with it? Did you swallow it like I did, or did you snap back? Drop it in the comments. I want to hear your story, because I know I'm not the only one who's lived through this quiet kind of rejection. But tonight, sitting at that dinner table surrounded by people who thought they knew me, I wasn't just showing numbers. I wasn't just proving a point. I was about to drop a bomb none of them saw coming, and the best part was that I didn't even have to raise my voice. All I had to do was open the folder on my phone and let the truth speak louder than any of their bullshit ever could. There were so many moments over the years when I wanted to stand up in the middle of a conversation and just scream the truth at them, let the words tear through that house like a storm that had been building for over a decade. But instead I bit my tongue so hard it might as well have bled. I used to fantasize about it in traffic, during sleepless nights, even while slicing vegetables alone in my kitchen, just standing there at the dinner table and saying, "You don't know a goddamn thing about me," and watching their smug expressions fall flat. But I didn't. I swallowed it every time, not because I was weak, but because I wanted the reveal to be mine, to be sharp, controlled, unforgettable, and impossible to ignore. And it wasn't just about proving a point, either. It was about finally reclaiming all the versions of myself they denied, ignored, or tried to minimize into irrelevance. I remembered this one time, God, it stuck with me more than it should have, when Tom mocked my car in front of our father. He laughed, asked me if it even had working air conditioning, said something about Maya still driving that used tin can. I said nothing. I didn't tell him that I owned 2 luxury cars, both paid in full, one of them parked in a private garage in a building where monthly rent cost more than his mortgage. I didn't tell him that I didn't even drive that old sedan anymore. It was just the car I used when visiting my parents because I couldn't stomach the thought of hearing, "So who are you trying to impress?" if I pulled up in the real one. Then there was the time my father, during one of his usual offhand jabs disguised as parental concern, looked at me and said, "You're going to end up alone if you keep living in that little bubble of yours." He said it while slicing a piece of steak, not even looking at me, like my personal life was some hypothetical side note that didn't deserve a second thought. He didn't know, none of them knew, that I'd been in a relationship for almost a year with a man whose name they might have recognized if they ever bothered to read anything beyond Tom's quarterly reports. He's a best-selling author, the kind whose books get turned into screenplays, the kind whose fan base is so loyal they'd tattoo his quotes on their bodies. But I never brought him home. Not because I was ashamed, God, no, but because I couldn't bear the idea of him sitting at our dinner table while my father tried to measure his worth against Tom's fucking stock options. I kept all of it hidden, not just the cars and the relationship, but the money, the accolades, the respect I'd earned in rooms my family would never be invited into. I hid it out of spite, yes, but also out of pain that ran so deep, so long-standing, that even joy felt tainted by the knowledge that they'd never see me without comparing me to the golden boy. There was a burning, twisted comfort in knowing I had a life that thrived entirely outside of their view, a life they'd never be able to take credit for or twist into another reminder that I was somehow less. And maybe, in some way, I wanted it to hurt when they finally saw it. Not just surprise them, but cut into that smugness and leave a scar. People always say success is the best revenge, but I think that's only half true. Success is only sweet when it slaps someone across the face who didn't believe you'd ever make it. Otherwise, it's just another number on a screen. That's why I started keeping what I called my receipts folder. Every time I achieved something, every milestone, every contract, every award, I documented it. Photos, screenshots, media mentions, even a recording of me speaking at a tech summit in New York where I was the keynote speaker. I didn't keep it for the memory. I kept it for the day I'd need it like a weapon. Because that's what it was, proof, power, and a quiet middle finger to every time they told me I was less. I wasn't just building a legacy. I was preparing for war. The kind of war you win with facts, with silence, with undeniable proof that you were never who they thought you were. That night, while they droned on about Tom's vacation house and his firm's new client, I opened my phone and clicked on the folder labeled Receipts. My fingers didn't shake. My smile didn't flicker. Because I wasn't just proving my worth, I was setting the stage for destruction, and God help them, they didn't even see it coming. The air around the dinner table felt heavier than before, thick with the same old arrogance, the same blind assumptions, the same unspoken rule that anything worth discussing had to revolve around Tom and his perfectly curated life. My father had just finished some long-winded monologue about how real success meant stability, structure, and a corporate ladder worth climbing, the kind with pensions and golf club memberships and men in tailored suits who all looked the same. Tom nodded along like a disciple absorbing the gospel, while my mother smiled politely, clearly relieved that she wasn't the subject of criticism for once. Lindsay sat there swirling her wine, bored, probably running through a mental list of all the ways she planned to redecorate their guest bathroom, and I just watched, silent, waiting, letting them dig their own graves without even realizing I was holding the shovel. When my father finally turned back to me with that look, the one that said he was about to deliver another one of his half-hearted attempts at fatherly wisdom wrapped in an insult, I knew it was time. I reached for my phone, placed it gently on the table, and tapped the screen with slow, deliberate movements, as if the moment deserved a kind of reverence none of them could understand. "I've been meaning to show you something," I said, my voice steady, my expression unreadable, the kind of calm that comes before a storm nobody sees forming. The first video played, a polished, high-production highlight reel from a private awards ceremony held at one of those rooftop venues in Manhattan, the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, filled with people whose names carried weight in industries my father would never dare to acknowledge as legitimate. There, in the center of it all, was me, standing behind a podium, shaking hands with CEOs, smiling as they announced my name as one of the top tech entrepreneurs in the country. The room in the video erupted in applause, voices cheering, cameras flashing, and yet, at this dinner table, in the house I grew up in, there was nothing but silence so thick I could almost taste it. My father cleared his throat, gripping his fork like it was the only thing grounding him to reality, his mind clearly scrambling for an explanation that fit the version of me he had spent years believing was true. Tom's smirk wavered for the first time all evening, a flicker of something uncertain flashing in his eyes, as if he were suddenly seeing me not as the quiet little sister who never quite measured up, but as someone entirely foreign, someone who had somehow outpaced him without even trying. He chuckled, low and forced, leaning back in his chair like it was all some kind of joke he hadn't fully understood yet. "Wow, Maya," he said, lifting his glass as if in mock celebration. "Look at you, making moves. Never thought you were the business type." I didn't even blink. Instead, I swiped my phone again, letting the next reveal hit like a brick to the face. My bank app opened, the numbers displayed in sharp, undeniable clarity, 7 figures sitting there in plain sight. No loans, no debt, no financial safety net from anyone but myself. A kind of nervous shift moved through the table, my mother inhaling sharply, Lindsay setting down her wine glass just a little too carefully, as if the weight of what she was seeing had suddenly made her question everything she thought she knew. Still, I wasn't done. I tapped the screen again, this time pulling up a neatly organized photo album labeled Properties, displaying image after image of high-end real estate, each one stamped with purchase dates, addresses, and proof of full ownership. Properties that weren't just homes but investments, assets that worked for me while I slept. Tom exhaled loudly through his nose, shaking his head as though trying to process something his ego simply wouldn't allow. Okay, I get it, you've done well," he said, his voice a little tighter now, a little less amused, like the reality of what was happening had started to sink in. Like he had just realized for the first time in his life that he was no longer the unquestioned center of attention. But the real moment of reckoning came with the final clip. I played a podcast interview, the voice of the host cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Meet Maya," the voice said, smooth and confident, the silent powerhouse behind one of the most successful online learning platforms in America. The clip went on, discussing how my company had reshaped digital education, how we had secured funding from some of the biggest investors in tech, how I had been featured in publications that lined the bookshelves of the very same corporate men my father idolized. Nobody spoke. My father's expression was unreadable, his lips pressed into a thin line, his hand tightening around his glass like he was still searching for something to hold onto. My mother looked at me like she wanted to say something, but the words never came. Tom looked anywhere but at me, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might break a tooth. Lindsay shifted in her chair, clearly wishing she could be anywhere but here, stuck in a moment she knew would change how they all saw me forever. Tom was the first to break the silence. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, an attempt to mask whatever storm was raging inside him. I tilted my head slightly, allowing the smallest hint of a smile to cross my lips, not a cruel one, not smug, just knowing, just honest. "Why would I?" I said simply, my voice carrying a weight that needed no further explanation. "You never asked." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything that had come before them, not just a statement, but an indictment, not just a truth, but a final, irreversible shift in the balance of power at this table. But the best part? I wasn't even done yet. There was a moment of stillness after I said it, a kind of stunned silence that didn't come from awe or admiration, but from something colder, deeper, something none of them were ready to face. The realization that the version of me they had carried around for years had never existed outside their own narrow, condescending minds. I could have ended it there, I suppose. I could have let that last line, "You never asked," linger as my final act, my closing statement, the mic drop they'd never forget. But I hadn't come this far to simply settle for silence and stares. No, I had one last card to play, and it wasn't just any card. It was the kind you save for the end of the game when you want to burn the whole damn table down. I tapped the screen again, slowly, letting the anticipation stretch until it practically hummed in the air. Their eyes followed every movement like a room full of people watching a bomb tick down to zero, but none of them knew just how explosive this next reveal would be. "There's something else you should know," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost casual, like I wasn't about to shift the ground beneath their feet forever. About 6 months ago, my company acquired another firm. Small deal. Nothing public, but strategic. I watched Tom's face closely. He leaned forward slightly, brow furrowing, not out of curiosity, but something else, something resembling instinctual dread. My finger hovered over the file name, just long enough to let the tension build like a storm behind glass. Then I clicked it. The screen lit up with a short presentation, simple, clear, brutally factual. Logos, timelines, transaction details, contract closures, merger impact projections. And there, in bold letters near the bottom of the slide, was the client name that hit like a brick to Tom's face, Holloway International. I didn't even need to say it aloud. The color drained from his face faster than wine poured down a sink. Tom sat back hard in his chair, jaw tight, lips slightly parted, like he was still trying to process what exactly he was looking at. That's our client," he said, barely above a whisper. I gave him a small nod, the kind people give before delivering a kill shot. "Was your client," I corrected softly, enunciating each word like a blade slicing through fabric. "They terminated their consulting contract 2 months ago. We're integrating their operations internally now." It was like watching a man unravel from the inside out. He blinked several times, trying to piece together a version of events where this wasn't happening, where he hadn't just found out that the company his firm relied on, the account that was supposed to secure his promotion, was now part of a portfolio owned by the sister he'd spent his whole life looking down on. He didn't speak. He couldn't. My father, however, had no such restraint. "What the hell is this?" he barked, eyes wide with disbelief, veins starting to bulge in his neck. "You're telling me you bought out your brother's client just to screw him over?" His voice had risen, trembling with anger and disbelief, but underneath it, I heard it, the fear. Not fear of what I'd done, but fear of what it meant. That his version of the world was no longer accurate. That his golden boy wasn't untouchable. That I had power, real, undeniable power, and I had just used it to knock the pedestal out from under their favorite son. "No," I said simply, leaning back in my chair with a calmness that only made his rage burn hotter. "I made a business decision. It just happened to cost Tom his promotion. Nothing personal. Just strategy." My father's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find a sentence strong enough to undo what had just happened. But there wasn't one. There was no lecture, no insult, no passive-aggressive remark that could erase the reality that their overlooked daughter had just pulled off the kind of corporate move that shattered their illusion of superiority in one swift, surgical strike. Tom stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't say a word, he just stormed out of the room like a man who knew he couldn't spin this loss into something flattering. My mother started to cry, not loud or dramatic, just soft tears that slid down her cheeks as she stared at her hands in her lap, as if they held some answer to a question she never thought she'd have to ask. Maybe she wasn't crying for me or even for Tom. Maybe she was crying for the years lost in pretending things were fine when they weren't, for all the dinners filled with quiet lies and silent comparisons. And me? I sat there and watched it all play out, not gloating, not celebrating, just absorbing the moment like a long exhale after years of holding my breath. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. But instead, something in me felt empty. Like I'd finally reached the summit I'd been climbing toward all my life only to find the view wasn't quite what I imagined. Why didn't it feel better? Why did this perfect revenge taste a little like ash in my mouth? I had won. I had outmaneuvered them all. But somewhere deep in the pit of my stomach, I could feel a strange, quiet ache that I hadn't prepared for, the kind that doesn't come from losing a battle, but from realizing that even victory can't rewrite the pain that led you there. The house was quiet after they all left, but it wasn't the kind of comforting silence you hope for after chaos. It was the hollow, heavy kind that pressed down on your chest like a weight you didn't expect to carry. I sat there alone, surrounded by the remnants of a dinner that now felt like the final scene in a play I'd been rehearsing my whole life. The roast had gone cold on the plates, the wine glasses half full, the tension still hanging in the air like thick smoke that refused to clear. I looked down at my phone, my fingers still hovering over the screen, and typed the words I thought would bring me peace. I sent a message to Rachel, short and simple. I did it. I finally did it. She replied almost instantly with excitement, with capital letters and virtual cheers and a flurry of pride that should have made me feel triumphant. But the strange thing was, I didn't feel anything close to victory. I felt hollow, like I had just spent years chasing a finish line only to realize it didn't lead anywhere that mattered. It hit me harder than I wanted to admit. This wasn't how I imagined it would feel. I thought I'd walk out of that room taller, stronger, bathed in a wave of validation I had craved since I was 17. Instead, I just felt tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with sleep, but the kind that seeps into your bones and whispers, "You've been fighting the wrong war." I sat there thinking about all the years I spent trying to prove I was worthy of attention, worthy of respect, worthy of love from people who never saw me clearly in the first place. I thought about every quiet moment I let slip by, every night I stayed up working when I could have been laughing, every second I chose success over peace because I thought one would lead to the other. But now that I had one, the other still felt painfully far away. I thought about the conversations I never had, the affection I never received, and how maybe I had built an entire empire just to hear one person say, "I'm proud of you," and now that it had never come. I wasn't sure what the hell I was supposed to do with all this success. My phone buzzed again, but it wasn't Rachel this time, it was Nick. I hadn't heard from him in almost a year, not since we'd ended things on terms so vague and unresolved they still echoed in my head some nights. His message was short, but not cold. Saw the video. "You were incredible. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, rereading it 3 times, unsure whether I felt comfort or caution. I hadn't thought about him in a long time, not in any way that felt urgent, but something about his words cracked open a space in me I thought I had sealed shut. I didn't reply. Not yet, but I didn't delete it either. I just sat there with it, letting the possibility of something different, something softer, take shape in the back of my mind. And maybe that's when I started to realize something I wish I had understood years ago. Revenge is loud, but peace is quiet. Peace doesn't come wrapped in applause or viral clips or 7-digit bank balances. It comes in small moments, in unspoken releases, in learning how to let go without needing an audience. It's the decision to stop proving and start simply being. Maybe it's time I choose quiet. Maybe the real rebellion isn't in tearing them down. It's in building something beautiful where their voices can't reach me anymore. I stood up from the table, walked into the kitchen, poured the wine down the sink, and tossed the rest of the roast in the trash. I didn't need to pretend anymore. I didn't need to sit at a table that had never truly welcomed me, and I sure as hell didn't need to keep rewriting myself just to make them comfortable. That night, I packed a small bag, booked a room in a quiet cabin 2 hours out of the city, and left without saying goodbye. No more dinners. No more carefully measured conversations. No more exhausting rituals of pretending to belong in a space that only tolerated me out of obligation. But before I could turn off my phone completely, one last message came through from my father. It was short, just a sentence, the final twist of the knife he always kept tucked behind his false concern. "You're still not better than your brother." No punctuation. No context. Just that. I stared at it for a moment, letting the words settle, realizing that no matter what I did, no matter how much I accomplished, that man would always hold onto his delusion like a lifeline. And then I smiled, not the bitter kind, not the satisfied smirk of revenge, but something quieter, something lighter. I deleted the message without replying. Not because it didn't sting, but because I finally knew it didn't matter. His opinion was no longer the currency I lived by. But even now, as I drove away from that house for what I hoped would be the last time, I couldn't help but wonder, did I really win, or did I just burn the bridge I had spent my whole life pretending I didn't want to cross? Maybe that's the part they don't tell you about revenge. It gives you closure, but not peace. And maybe peace was never meant to come from them anyway. Maybe it was mine to build all along.